In the forgotten corners of medieval Europe, where lords ruled by sword and priests by silence, something began to stir. It did not begin with armies or banners, but with women. Servants, widows, daughters, duchesses, singing verses too soft for courts to hear, yet too powerful to be erased. This is not a tale of kingdoms. It is the story of a flame passed hand in thread, in lullabies, in bruises that would not stay hidden. They were never meant to be remembered, but they remembered each other. Tonight, let the fire speak. Let their names rise in the smoke.
It began with a glance across the feast fire. Isolde was 15 that spring, her hair still braided in the simple style of village girls, her hands calloused from milking goats and hauling water, but something had changed. Perhaps it was the May wind that carried pollen and longing, or perhaps it was the way Sir Aldrich, the Reeve's son, looked at her over the rim of his clay cup. That night, the village gathered for the saint's day. Barrels of ale had been rolled out. Children threw herbs into the fire, and the unmarried girls danced around the maypole with ribbons in their hands and caution in their eyes. Isolde had danced too, her feet clumsy but her heart quickening with each spin. When the sun fell, the bonfire took its place, and that was when Aldrich's gaze caught hers. He was not yet a knight, but he wore the confidence of one. Isolde knew him, of course she did. Their families shed sheep, their mothers had argued over a sick lamb the year before. But tonight he didn't feel like a boy from her world. He looked like a promise her body didn't yet understand. When he approached, it was only to pass her a small crust of honey bread. Not a word spoken, not a touch exchanged. But it was enough. That night, lying on a straw-stuffed mattress beside her snoring grandmother, Isolde stared at the rafters and tried to name the fire in her chest. The days after felt different. She bathed without being told. She took longer to braid her hair. Her fingers hovered on the embroidery threads that once bored her. And when she passed Aldrich at the well, they nodded, nothing more, but in her mind it was a poem. But nothing stays hidden in a village. Zoon, whispers circled like flies on summer meat. The Reeve's son, some said, as she's reaching above her haystack. Muttered others. One night her father struck her. Not hard, just once. But the message landed deep. Do not invite shame, he hissed. Isolde learned then the rules. A woman's desire was allowed only when summoned. She was to be chosen, not choosing. Silent, not seeking, but her body didn't listen. Her skin still remembered the way Aldrich looked at her, and her mind began writing poems. She dared not speak aloud. She began hiding them in the roots of an ash tree behind her house. Words she barely understood, metaphors born from sweat and birdsong, verses that described nothing and everything. One day she found one missing, in its place was another, written in a different hand, a reply, Aldrich. He had found her words, and answered. It began there, a secret verse each week, sometimes left under stone, sometimes tied with flax twined to a branch. No names, no plans. He compared her voice to honey in a storm. She called him the sun behind the iron. But nothing in their world stayed untouched by rules. When Aldrich's uncle discovered him humming a verse aloud, suspicion was born. His letters stopped. Her tree remained empty, and the silence was worse than a slap. Weeks passed. Harvest came. Isolde's mother braided her hair tightly again as if binding her spirit down. We will speak to the mason's son, she announced one dusk. He has learned, he's not foolish. That night Isolde returned to the ash tree and tore every poem to shreds. But in that rage came something new. She began writing again, not for Aldrich, not for love, for herself. Angry aching verses, lines that spat and moaned. Her words turned bold, no longer metaphors but truths. She began to understand. Her hunger was not sin. It was knowledge, and knowledge in this world was dangerous. She had begun her descent, or perhaps her ascent. The chapel stood on the edge of the forest where light broke into filtered gold, and the trees whispered secrets in Latin. Fold arrived with a linen bundle and the weight of her mother's disappointment. It was not a convent yet, but it was where girls were sent to learn piety, penance, and the proper folding of altar cloths, a temporary refuge, a warning. Let her be watched, her mother had said. Let her prayers cleanse her tongue. Inside the chapel was cold, stone beneath bare feet, bread that tasted like ash, the rhythm of bells, always bells, matins at dawn, prayers at noon, silence at night. Isolde obeyed. She lit candles. She scrubbed floors. She mended robes. She held her words behind her teeth. But her mind, traitorous, would not kneel. It wandered, often back to the tree, the verses, the way Aldrich's letters curled at the edges. Then further, the feeling beneath her skin when she wrote alone, the ache of wanting without asking. Here, beneath the carved eyes of saints, that ache did not vanish. It intensified. And then came Sister Amara. She was older, but not by much. Her hands moved like wind on water. Her voice never rose, yet everyone listened. She taught Isolde how to blend herbs for incense, how to iron robes without scorching them. But more than that, she noticed. Her eyes wander when you scrub, Amara said one afternoon. Would you write? Isolde froze. No, sister. Amara only smiled, slow and knowing. You should. That night a quill and parchment appeared on Isolde's straw mattress. From then on the chapel changed. By day it was a place of discipline. But at night, behind the storeroom door, by the glow of a beeswax candle, it became a place of rebirth. Amara showed her poems, ancient, forgotten, forbidden. Isolde showed her verses, raw, untamed, bleeding truth. They spoke through writing at first, then whispers, then silence, too loud to ignore. One evening, rain drummed against the chapel windows. The floor was slick with mist. Isolde sat beside Amara, her fingers damp with ink and nerves. Is there sin? She asked. Amara looked at her, long and soft. What they call sin is often just something they fear, and then nothing grand, just a touch. Amara's hand on hers, not lust, not conquest, just presence, permission. That night Silk dreamed not of Aldrich, but of a fire smouldering beneath the chapel floor. It didn't burn the saints, it warmed them. It whispered, you are not alone, but nothing hidden remains safe, forever. A novice named Petra saw them, or thought she did, a door closing too softly, a shadow staying too long, a hush where there should have been chant. The next morning, Isolde was summoned. Not by a priest, but by Father Corvinus, the church's appointed confessor. Its chambers were lined with books, inkpots, instruments not meant for music. He questioned her gently, then sternly, then with threats. The devil tempts even through pious hands, he said. Did you allow her to touch you with corruption? Isolde said nothing, but silence in this world is not neutrality. It is guilt. Amara was gone the next day. No farewell. No explanation. The cell swept clean, the scent of lavender left behind like a ghost. No one spoke her name after that. That night Isolde returned to the chapel alone. She lit no candle. She knelt. And beneath her breath, she recited every poem she could remember, not to be forgiven, but to remember she had been seen. They called it a return. Isolde was fetched from the chapel 2 weeks after Amara vanished. Her mother arrived with tight lips and a freshly sewn cloak. No word of what had happened. No mention of why. Just the command, come, we have found you a husband. The carriage that rolled into their village was not for love, nor honour, nor joy. It was law veiled in lace. The man's name was Edric de Vere, a minor noble from the northern coast, recently widowed twice. He had land, he had coin, and more importantly, he had influence. A fine match, her father declared. He will want for nothing. Isolde wanted for nothing. She wanted nothing, but no one asked. The wedding was small and cold, not from lack of guests, but from the weather and the bride's silence. A veil was placed over her face like a shroud. She said the vows with hollow breath. She sipped from the shared cup of mead and tasted only dust. In the corner, an old woman hummed a hymn meant for birth, not marriage. That night they entered the marriage chamber. A room that smelled of old stone and new blood. Edric was not cruel. Not in the way monsters are, but he was entitled. He peeled back her dress with the detachment of someone unwrapping a parcel. When she didn't meet his eyes, he chuckled. Still shy. That's charming. She had been taught that marriage sanctified what would otherwise be sin. That a husband's touch was holy. That to resist was rebellion, not just against a man, but against God. But lying beneath Edric's weight, Isolde knew none of that was true. What was happening was not sacred. It was expected. The next morning she bled into sheets embroidered with lilies. The servants took them without a word. Of his now approven, the village priest smiled wider that week. But something in Isolde hardened. Days passed. Edric left often for business, for hunting, for politics. She was left in the manor with her thoughts, her silence, and a single locked cabinet where she hid her parchment and ink. She wrote, not verses of longing, but of anger. Of the way her body split into two. One that performed smiled, knelt, and one that screamed from the inside. Her poetry became sharper, darker, filled with clenched fists and broken rosaries. She burned most of them in the hearth. Until the maid found one. Her name was Brienne, a girl not much younger than Wold, and Isolde had been in the chapel. She came to change linens, noticed a scrap of parchment still warm from the fire's edge. She read it. She didn't speak, but the next day, when she came again, she slipped a folded note under the pillow. Just one word, I see you. For the first time since her wedding, Isolde felt breath return to her chest. The two began to exchange letters, hidden in books, in baskets, in pockets sewn into dresses. Brienne spoke of her own bruises, of her brother's debt that had forced her into service, of how she sometimes heard Isolde crying and pressed her ear to the stone wall. Oh, you're not the only one, she wrote once. At night, when Edric returned, Isolde did what she must. She smiled. She obeyed. She survived. But the fire beneath her lace veil had returned. Not passion, resolve. One afternoon, Brienne guided her to a disused tower room. "And no one checks here," she whispered. "If you ever need air." It became their sanctuary. They never kissed, never touched beyond passing notes or shared hands on the windowsill, but something intimate bloomed there. Not romance, something stronger. A vow. Ow. "If I ever run," Isolde said, "will you come?" Brienne didn't hesitate. "If I don't lead," but the world outside their tower room was always watching. And the law wore gold rings and smelled of mead. Their time was running out. The first rumour came as a cough, delicate and poisonous. Lady Morwena, wife of the local magistrate, spoke it over veal and spiced pears at a feast. The young Lady de Vere, she writes in secret. My maid swears she saw ink on her nightgown. She laughed lightly as if it were only a jest. But in that room full of silk and suspicion, it was enough. By week's end, 3 other households had whispered the same. She walks alone too often. If she speaks too gently to the help, if she does not yet carry a child. Curious, is it not? And in the manor, Edric heard. He returned from a hunting trip with red on his cloak. Not blood, but wine from a tavern whose serving girl had mentioned Isolde's name. He found her in the solar bent over embroidery, the false work she used when her hands ached from poetry. "You dishonor me," he said. Isolde did not look up. I breathe. He struck her, not hard. Not cruel, not cruel. With the back of a hand made heavier by insult. "You are a wife, not a girl in the woods, not some chapel ghost." She did not cry. That night, Brienne brought warm towels and tears she did not shed in front of others. "They'll watch more now," she whispered. "They're speaking of sending for a priest." Isolde sat beside the fire. The flame reflected in her bruised cheek. Then let them. The two met less often. The tower grew cold. Their letters shorter. The ink shakier. One night Brienne left a folded cloth instead of words. Inside it, a small knife. "Not long. Not sharp. But enough. I don't mean for blood," the note said. "I mean for locks." The next week Isolde picked open the cabinet in the east hallway. Inside she found an old velvet box of her late husband's first wife, letters, perfume, a rosary, and beneath it all a journal. She read it by slivered moonlight in the tower. The first wife, Helene, had written of loneliness, of being silenced, of waking in the night to cold sheets and colder stairs. The last entry was a single line: I stood too close to the edge, and no one pulled me back. The next morning, Edric had announced her death as a fall. Isolde folded the journal, tied it in linen and buried it beneath the hearthstone in the tower. She began writing again, not for herself, not for Brienne, but for Helene. Poems filled with bones and lace of women stitched into rolls too small for their breath. She stopped hiding them. She left one in the sewing basket, another inside the bread oven, a third in Edric's own study, tucked beneath a legal scroll about obedience. The whispers returned, but this time they grew louder. Ishi is unstable. Ishi is unclean. Ishi must be corrected. Brienne begged her to stop. We can still leave. We can go to the southern coast. There are widows there who take in women like us. Isolde stared into the fire, eyes empty. Won't believe they'd let us go. That night she dreamed of being sewn into her own wedding dress, threaded in, suffocating, stitched until she vanished beneath lace and law. When she awoke, the manor was on fire, not truly. But the hearth had flared and one of her verses had fallen in, igniting a curtain. The servants put it out quickly, but the damage was done. Edric saw. The priest was summoned. Father Ranulph arrived 2 days later. A man with polished boots and a voice that dripped honeyed threat. He examined her room, questioned her hours, asked her if she'd ever have felt the devil inside his skin. She answered nothing, until he touched the parchment. He read one line aloud, a line about bones breaking for beauty, and then he smiled. You need correction. The punishment would begin at dawn. That night, Brienne came to her room in silence, her hair unbraided, her hands shaking. We can go. Now, Isolde looked to the fire, to the knife beneath her pillow, to the window above the herb garden. For the first time, she did not hesitate. The wind that night howled like a thing alive. Isolde stood at the window of her chamber, staring into the darkness beyond the herb garden. Below, Brienne waited, cloaked in shadow, her hands gripping the reins of a borrowed mule, her breath clouds in the cold. In Isolde's hand was the knife, not for fighting. For cutting the laces of the dress she had worn too long. She slipped silently down the corridor, the manor asleep or pretending to be. Edric was gone, summoned by court business or his own cowardice, but Father Ranulph was not. He had asked to sleep in the chapel, but to pray for her salvation. Isolde knew better. He meant to watch her soul shrink before dawn. She would not give him the chance. The garden gate creaked. Brienne turned, eyes wide with urgency. Are you ready? Isolde nodded, her voice a ghost. I know, but I'm going anyway. They rode hard, not fast. The mule was slow and stubborn but steady. And the night was thick with mist and menace. They didn't speak. Only the rhythm of hooves on dirt, the rustle of cloaks. Brienne knew the back path, through the brambles, across the stream, under the skeletal branches of trees too old to whisper. We'll reach the mill by sunrise, she said. After that, we'll need new names. They didn't reach the mill. The hunt began before dawn. A torch glimmered on the ridge behind them. Then 2, then 5. Edric's men loyal, well-paid and far more invested in control and justice. With them rode Ranulph, his black cloak flaring behind him like the wings of a vulture. A split! Brienne cried. If they catch one, the other can still... No, Isolde said, tightening her grip on the reins. We stay. They turned off the main path down toward the marshes. The land grew soft, wet. The mule slowed. Brienne leapt down, leading the beast by the reins. Isolde followed, her shoes sinking into mud. Behind them, dogs howled. They've loosed the hounds, Brienne whispered. Yerda, Isolde said. Yeah, let them come. Let them see what we've become. They're around now, no more riding. The mule abandoned. their cloaks heavy with dew. The horizon shifted from black to deep blue. Dawn approached like a blade. In the distance, a bell tolled once. A warning, a prayer, or a judgment. They reached an abandoned shrine near the marsh's edge. A place where saints had once been honoured, but now stood headless from war or rot. The roof half collapsed. The altar crumbled, but it was shelter. They ducked inside, chests heaving. Isolde Brienne gasped. If they catch us, they won't, but they did. The first man entered silently, sword drawn. He was young, barely older than Eldrick had been. Behind him came another, and another, until there were 5. Then Father Ranulph stepped in, smug and certain. Well, he said, the lamb has strayed, and dragged a servant into the brambles. Sin is contagious, I suppose. Isolde stood, mud on her dress. Boo. Blood at her temple where a branch had struck her, but her eyes were fire. You call this sin, she said, to run from a man who took what he never asked for? To write words no one gave me permission to speak? To breathe without asking your blessing? Ranulph raised a hand. You are not beyond saving. I don't want to be saved, she hissed. But it was over. They were dragged from the shrine, bound with rope made for livestock. Brienne cried out once. Only once, when they tied her wrists too tight. Isolde didn't flinch. They were taken not back to the manor, but to the square. Because punishment for women like them was not quiet. It had to be seen. The square was already full when they arrived. It wasn't a market day yet. Every soul from the surrounding villages had gathered, drawn not by stalls or spices, but by the promise of shame, of punishment, of spectacle. For in a world like theirs, justice was rarely quiet and never kind. Isolde and Brienne were dragged into the centre, wrists bound, cloaks torn, faces streaked with dirt and blood. The wooden platform had been hastily rebuilt from the last time it was used, for the baker who sold grain laced with sand. This time, however, there would be no execution. Not yet. This was to be a trial. Atop the platform stood Father Ranulph, flanked by Lord Edric, whose face bore no bruises of grief, only the irritation of inconvenience. A scribe sat beside them, quill at the ready, though most of what was said would be remembered in whispers more than ink. The crowd buzzed like a hive, children on shoulders, old men hawking into the mud, women clutching prayer beads with one hand and gossip with the other. Ranulph raised his hand. The silence, he intoned. This is not a celebration, this is purification. The silence that followed was not reverent, it was hungry, He turned to the crowd, voice amplified by righteousness. Isolde of Caerhallow, wife to Lord Edric de Vire, stands accused of rebellion, fornication, slander, and heretical writings. Her accomplice, a servant girl named Brienne of unknown parentage, is charged with abetting treason and spreading temptation through this house and beyond. Gasps. Isolde said nothing. Brienne trembled beside her, but she did not cry. Their hands found each other for one brief moment, before the guards yanked them apart. Ranulph lifted a piece of parchment. This, he said, was found in her own cabinet. Read aloud by one of our own scribes. Listen, he read. If the saints require silence, then let them gag me with iron. For I will speak with scorched breath and burn my shame into their marble eyes. A murmur passed through the square like wind before a storm. Ranulph turned to her. Do you deny writing this? And raised her chin. No, he blinked. You admit to heresy? You admit to truth. He tried again. Do you repent? She laughed softly. Not enough to kneel. The priest's face darkened. Edric leaned in, whispering something, but Ranulph shook his head. We must show mercy, he said aloud, though his eyes burned. For the sake of her soul. Punishment would not be death. Not yet. The sentence, public scourging, 10 lashes. Then isolation in the chapel until a penance and purity return. Brienne as a servant would receive 20. An exile. The crowd hissed. Some applauded. Others looked away. The women were led to a wooden post set in the square's far side. The whip was leather, cruelly knotted. Brienne went first. She bit her lips so hard she bled. Isolde counted every stroke aloud. One, E2, the 3 was her turn. She did not scream. By the 5th lash, her knees buckled. By the 7th, blood darkened the back of her dress. By the 10th, she whispered only one word. Still, they were dragged from the post, thrown into separate carts. Brienne banished toward the southern woods. Isolde! Locked in the old chapel at the edge of Edric's estate, a guard stationed outside, torch always lit. But as the cartwheels turned away, a woman from the crowd stepped forward. She wore grey. Her hands were scarred. Her voice cracked from disuse, but when she shouted it carried. It too wrote poems once, and then another voice, and another. I danced in the marsh when I was young. I kissed a girl at the festival of rain. We bled and still I breathed. The crowd shifted. Some sneered, but some looked down. Some clenched their jaws. Some, just for a moment, saw the truth. This was not justice. It was fear wrapped in ritual, and it had cracked. The chapel smelled of rot and wax. Stone walls damp from centuries of silence hugged Isolde like the cold arms of a nun who never believed in mercy. The light came not from windows. There were none but from a single torch mounted above the altar. It hissed with dampness, casting long shadows across broken pews and cracked icons. This was not a place of prayer. This was a tomb where the still living were buried by shame. They had locked the door from the outside, bolted the iron. The key hung from the belt of a boy no older than 14 who stood watch, eyes glazed from fear or boredom. Once a day, a tray was pushed through the slit at the bottom of the door. Crusts of bread, cold broth, water with bits of ash still floating in it. But Isolde did not hunger for food. She hungered for words. At first she lay on the ground and wept, not from pain. The lashes had faded into numbness, but from fury. Her body had survived, her voice had not, or so she thought. On the second day, she found a shard of clay beneath the stone altar. Once part of a chalice, maybe. It was jagged, palm-sized. She held it in the light, turned it in her hand. Then she walked to the wall behind the altar, the smoothest one, and began to carve. One line, then another. If silence is holy, I choose blasphemy. She carved more. At night, when the guard dozed. At noon, when the torch flickered. She carved with blood when her fingers split. Her nails blackened. Her wrist throbbed. Still she carved. By the end of the 3rd day, the wall bore 15 lines. By the 4th, it sang. She remembered verses Brienne had whispered in the dark. Words from the old tales. From women who sang to the moon, who stitched resistance into linens, who turned shame into firelight. She gave them voice, and the chapel listened. Each night, the boy at the door grew more restless. She heard him shifting, muttering. One evening he spoke. "A lady?" She froze. "I heard it," he whispered, her voice. It sounded like prayer. But not the kind we know. She walked slowly to the door, pressed her face against the gap. Then perhaps it's the kind we need. A pause. Then his voice cracking with fear. "They say you bewitched the servant girl." Isolde smiled bitterly. And no, she bewitched herself by daring to feel. The boy asked no more. But the next day, the tray came with a piece of charcoal, hidden under the crust. She wept for that, not from sorrow, but from hope. She began writing on the floor now, on the wood beams. She drew symbols, verses, sigils, that no priest had taught her. She created a new liturgy, not for saints, but for the unheard. And then on the 6th day, the door creaked open. Not fully, but enough. She expected the boy. Instead, it was a woman, hooded in grey, her hands scarred. Isolde recognized her, the same woman who had stepped forward in the square. "You shouldn't be here," Isolde whispered. The woman smiled. "And neither should you." They stood in silence. Then Isolde asked, "Why risk it?" The woman reached into her cloak and drew out a folded cloth. Inside, pages, inked by hand. "Your words are spreading," she said. "There's someone smuggled them out." They've reached the bathhouses, the laundry halls, the abbey kitchens, even the wives of lords who pretend they never bleed. Isolde's breath caught. "You started a fire," the woman said. "And now you must choose, burn with it or walk free through the smoke." A pause. "I'm ready," Isolde said. The woman nodded. "As morrow, at dawn, there will be a shift in the guard. You will walk out, head covered, say nothing. Follow the path to the east where the birches bend low. There someone waits." Isolde reached out, fingers trembling. "Who are you?" she asked. The woman touched her palm as someone you freed, and then she was gone. She stepped out with the first breath of dawn. The chapel door closed behind her like a breath held too long. Her steps were light, silent, though every bone in her body still ached from the lashes. The shawl wrapped around her head was coarse and unwashed, but it hid her face well enough. Her blood had dried beneath the fabric of her dress, crusted into stiff patches against her back. Still, she walked. The boy was nowhere to be seen. Whether he had been dismissed or chosen to turn away, she did not know. She only knew the door had opened, and her feet now followed the direction she had been given. East, where the birches bend low, she left the chapel grounds like a shadow. Not a soul stirred in the manor beyond the walls. Lord Edric would still be sleeping, if he slept at all. Perhaps he was still drunk from the feast of power he had feasted on since his shaming. She passed through the lower fields, beyond the fence where laundry once hung, where Brienne had once spun tales of women turned to stars. The grass here was heavy with dew, brushing against her legs like a whisper. Her breath was pale in the cold morning air, and then she saw them. The birches, tall and pale as bones, they arched toward each other at the top of the ridge, like women bowing their heads in mourning. Wind whispered through them. The leaves shimmered with the quiet strength of things that survived being cut again and again. At the base of the birch grove stood a man. He wore a cloak the color of wet stone, hood down, face rough with stubble and time. At his side hung no sword, only a bag slung low over one shoulder. He did not speak when he saw her. When he saw her, he simply turned and walked deeper into the trees. She followed. They moved in silence for some time, through moss-covered paths, past deer trails and streams that shimmered like silver threads in the morning light. The world felt new here, unwritten. After a while she asked, "Who sent you?" He looked back once, voice low. "I was saying what you lit the fire for." She frowned. "How many are there?" He smirked. "Enough to know your name, babe. Enough to carry your words." He led her to a hollow beneath a ridge, where an old chapel stone had collapsed long ago, now covered in moss and bramble. Inside was a small camp, fire not yet lit, baskets of herbs, a rolled mat, a kettle hanging from hook carved into an ancient root. "You'll rest here," he said. "And you'll meet the circle?" "A circle?" He nodded. "Women like you, some older, some just girls. One was once a healer, one was once a nobleman's wife. All of them were punished for speaking, touching, desiring." Her voice cracked. He looked away. "If she made it out," he said softly, "south of the river, we believe she's safe. But she won't return here. She fears her presence would bring hunters." Isolde sat down slowly, the ache in her back returning like an echo. "She should not fear," she whispered. "And no," he agreed. "But fear is a faithful ghost." He handed her a folded cloth. Inside, clean bandages, a strip of dried lavender and a sliver of soap, and she looked at them as if they were gold. "Rest," he said. "For tonight the circle gathers." He left her alone. Isolde washed at the stream in silence. The cold water bit into her skin, but it made her feel alive. She cleaned the lashes on her back, pressed lavender into the wounds. She scrubbed her hands, her neck, even under her fingernails, like she was shedding not just dirt, but the past. As the sun dipped, she lit the fire. Her hands were steady, her breath full. At dusk they came. Women walking in single file, some with grey hair, some with eyes that had seen battle, one with a child wrapped to her chest. They wore no emblems, no robes, no sigils, but their presence was holy. They sat in a circle around the fire, not speaking, not chanting, just being. One of them, a woman with a burn scar over her jaw, turned to Isolde and said, "Tell us what they took." Isolde opened her mouth, and for the first time since the square, since the whip, since the chapel, she spoke freely. There were no drums, no chants, no ritual prayers, only fire and silence. The women sat in a ring around the flame, their shadows long and uneven on the forest floor. The trees above rustled softly as if listening, faithless. Smoke curled upward, not heavy but fragrant. Someone had thrown crushed lavender and rosemary into the flames. It smelled like healing, like forgotten gardens, like stories waiting to return. Isolde sat across from the scarred woman. She had spoken her name, Ira, with a voice that sounded like earth cracking open. Her eyes were hard but not cruel. Her hands never fidgeted. When she sat, she became a stone. "Tell us," Ira said again. "Come." And what they took? Isolde closed her eyes. "It was 12, she began, when I first bled. The midwife told me I was ready for marriage. I didn't understand what that meant. I thought it meant I could braid my hair differently, wear shoes with silver tips." She opened her eyes. I was wrong. The women said nothing, but their stillness was a kind of agreement. They married me to a man 30 years older. His teeth were black, his fingers, she swallowed. He treated me like a field to be ploughed, not a soul to be loved. Someone across the fire winced. And when I flinched, Isolde continued, they told me to be still, that a wife must be still, silent, grateful. Ira nodded slowly. "Louis?" "They told all of us that." One of the younger women, a girl with cropped hair and a missing tooth, spoke up. "I poisoned mine." The circle turned. She shrugged. It was herbs, nothing harsh. His belly turned, his eyes crossed, and he died by dawn. They said it was punishment from the saints for his sins. Another woman smiled. The saints do have their uses. Laughter rippled across the circle. Dry, quiet, but real, ill. And with that, the circle opened. One by one they told their stories. A former abbess who had been banished for writing love poems to a fellow sister. A noblewoman whose son had died in war, and whose grief was deemed hysterical. A servant girl caught in the wrong bed, sentenced to shave her head and clean the church floor with her tongue. A midwife who had refused to lie about a child's legitimacy. Each tale was a wound, but also a weapon, and every time a story ended, the fire flared, as if remembering with them. When it came back to Isolde, she spoke of Brienne, of soft touches, of verses whispered into skin, of kisses that tasted like rainwater and rebellion. "She made me feel real," Isolde whispered. Like I wasn't a vessel for someone else's hunger, but a vessel of my own longing, Ira nodded. "And for that they tried to erase you, but they failed," another woman added. "Yes," said Ira, "because you are here." A girl with a missing tooth leaned forward. "What do we do now?" The question hung in the smoke. Ira stood. She walked to the edge of the circle and pulled something from a satchel. A small wooden box. She opened it. Inside, parchment, charcoal, a simple quill. She set them down on a flat stone beside the fire. "We write," she said. "Write what?" asked the girl. "Our truths," Ira replied. Asked the girl. "So that when they silence our mouths, they cannot silence our hands." One woman murmured, "They'll burn it." Ira nodded. "Then we write again." They passed the parchment. Isolde watched as each woman bent to the task. Some wrote names. Some drew symbols. Some scratched lines of poetry barely legible but burning with clarity. When it was her turn, hesitated. Then she wrote, "We are not ashamed of our hunger. We are not broken by our bruises. We are the fire you cannot drown." She passed the page. The girl with the missing tooth grinned. "You're a poet." Isolde looked at her, then at the others. "No," she said. "I'm a mirror." And around the fire, the women reflected each other, cracked, chipped, gleaming. They wrote until the stars faded. And when morning came, they buried the parchment in a sealed jar beneath the root of the birch tree where Isolde had first met the cloaked man. "We will return for it," Ira said. "One day, and if not," she added silently, "someone will." They came at dawn, not with horns or banners, but with quiet steps and sharper eyes. Forest men in the service of lords, not kings, hunters of silence, trackers of smoke. Their boots sank into the moss of the hollow long after the circle had gone. The fire was still warm. They found only ashes, a few footprints, and a single black feather wedged in the bark of a birch. No parchment, no names, no evidence of rebellion, only a suggestion which was far more dangerous. The leader of the hunting party, a man called Grieving, knelt by the fire pit. He picked up a splinter of half-burnt rosemary and sniffed it. Then he spat. Witchcraft, he muttered. One of the younger men, barely past 16, shifted nervously. But there's no circle drawn, no symbols. Gudrun said. They're just hidden in the smoke. He stood. Send word to the warden. Tell him the rumors are true. The women have gathered. By then, Isolde was far from the grove. She and Ira had led the others north, splitting into smaller pairs that fanned out like droplets of water fleeing from a cracked bowl. She travelled now with a girl called Thera, the one with the missing tooth and a laughter that never stayed buried for long. They moved quickly, avoiding roads, sleeping in caves or abandoned sheds. The forest became their cloak, the crows their company. Do you think they'll find it? Thera asked one night, poking at the meager fire they dared to light. The parchment? Thera nodded. Isolde shook her head. We buried it too deep, Thera grinned, and maybe roots will grow around it, wrap it like a secret. Isolde smiled, but her eyes remained on the dark. She could feel the weight of something growing behind them. Hooves, hounds, or worse, betrayal. 3 nights later, they found refuge in a weaving hut near the river. A woman there, Lena, offered them stew and straw beds, no questions asked. She had seen the fire circle once, years ago, before her husband turned her in for reading psalms aloud. He died with a knife in his throat, Lena said, stirring the pot. Fell on it, they said. I never corrected them. They ate in silence. That night, Thera slept deeply for the first time in days. Isolde did not. She crept out to the river. The moonlight made the surface gleam like polished bone. She knelt, letting the water run over her fingers, and then she heard it. A twig snapped behind her. She turned, and there stood Gedrin. He had no sword drawn, no snarl on his face, only a leather satchel slung across his chest and a thin rope tied to his belt. I thought it might be you, he said. She said nothing. You've made quite the story of yourself, he continued. The women whisper your name in churches. Even some men. Still, she didn't move. You know, she said, I lost a sister once. She was accused of laying hands on the wrong girl. They shaved her head. Drove her from the village. He stepped closer. I didn't stop them. I was young, scared. They told me if I stayed quiet, I could stay safe. Now Isolde stood. Is that why you hunt us? She asked. And to make sure no one else speaks? His jaw clenched. I hunt you because I know the cost of silence. He opened the satchel and pulled out a small pouch. Inside it, ashes. I found the fire took what was left. I thought it might mean something. She stared. Then he took out the rope. I can tell them I never found you, he said. But it will cost me everything. She understood. Not just the risk, but the sorrow underneath it. What do you want in return? He looked at her, not like a captor, but like someone asking for absolution. Tell me what you wrote, he said. So I can carry it if you fall, she breathed, then recited. We are not ashamed of our hunger. We are not broken by our bruises. We are the fire you cannot drown. Gedrin closed his eyes. Then he dropped the rope. When she returned to the hut, Thera was still sleeping. The wind stirred outside, and far off a crow cried. Days passed, the circle moved like wind through grass, never lingering, never still. But their stories travelled faster. In taverns, the scullery maids began humming strange verses. In convents, nuns traced secret runes into bread dough before it arose. In cities, a new game spread among girls. tying black threads into braids and whispering, "We are the fire. They burn nothing, but they lit everything." Even in the manor where Isolde once served, a young boy sweeping the steps stopped one day and found a folded scrap beneath a stone. She speaks, and the forest listens. He read it, pocketed it, and never said a word. The Bishop of Enmere could not sleep, not because of ghosts, not because of guilt, but because the hymns had changed. In the great chapel, where women once sang only in Latin, there were new rhythms now, verses whispered under breath, barely audible above the echo of bells, but unmistakably there. Words like longing and hunger. Bruce and Birch had found their way into prayer, and he had no idea where it started. He summoned his scribes, ordered them to monitor the nuns, to examine hymnals, to scour confessionals for any mention of the fire. But the fire had no beginning, because it had been lit in too many places at once. In a village 2 days south, a midwife named Drina placed a single black ribbon in the braid of a newborn girl. She said nothing to the mother, but the woman saw it and smiled. In a convent by the sea, a novice painted lines of poetry on the underside of her habit, so close to her skin that the words left ink on her ribs. In the kitchens of House Calwan, maids began to hum while preparing the Lord's meals. Not the usual drinking tunes or bridal chants, but a melody soft and strange, as she bleeds and still she sings. She burns and still she dances. The stable boys caught on, then the scullions, and soon the daughters of knights began asking to wear black thread bracelets. "They say it protects them from silence," whispered one girl to her sister. And silence more than swords was what the lords feared. Sword heard these stories not from messengers but from the earth itself, from scratch marks carved into trees, from herbs left in certain patterns on moss, from river stones stacked 3 high beside bridges. Each was a wordless letter passed hand to hand without ink. She and Thera travelled lightly now, no parchment, no flame, only memory and voice. At night they met with others, sometimes 5, sometimes 50. They taught verses, shared stories, encouraged the writing of truth on things no one would suspect, the inside of shoes, the hems of aprons, the backs of pews. "This is not a rebellion," Isolde told them, her voice low. "This is a remembering." Ira joined them again near the harvest with 2 new women. One a former baker with knife scars on her hands, the other a widow who spoke only in riddles. The circle had no leader, no temple. And yet it grew. One day Thera returned from a scouting trip pale and shaking. "They've started to punish the silence," she said. "What do you mean?" Ira asked. "They arrested a girl in Dravemont for not singing the right hymns." "And not singing," Isolde said. "And not singing. They say it's proof she knew the wrong ones." That night they built a fire for the first time in weeks. It was small. It crackled quietly beneath a canopy of stars, and each woman there added a word to the flame, not aloud but into the silence. They closed their eyes and gave the fire their fear, then their fury, then their names. Somewhere in the north, a young noblewoman opened her wardrobe and found that her maid had stitched something along the hem of her wedding dress. "You do not belong to the hand that holds your dowry," the noblewoman said nothing. But when the wedding feast came, she wore the dress proudly and walked herself to the altar. People whispered, but none of them could deny the fire in her steps. The lords and bishops convened in stone halls, see. They drafted edicts, banned black ribbons, sent scribes to destroy books of folk song. But it was too late. The verses had taken root in breath. The fire was beneath their feet. They had not meant to reach the castles. The circle was born in forest shadows, grown in bakeries and by candlelight in servant halls. Their words were meant for the bruised, not the crowned. But fire has no manners. It follows breath, not bloodlines. And so it was that the first to carry the verse into the citadel was not a spy, but a daughter, Lady Ilara of Miralt. 17, Pale as the first frost, betrothed since birth to a man 3 times her age, she had never bled for love, only duty. And when her mother braided her hair for the ceremony, she whispered, "Do not cry. Daughters are for alliances." Alira did not cry. She sang, not the wedding hymns, but something she had learned from a maid while playing with thread. "I will go where I choose to bloom. I will not bend for thorns." No one noticed at first. It sounded like any old rhyme. But when she sang it again on a wedding night, alone, in a room locked from the inside, her husband beat the door until his fists bled. She never opened it. The next morning she appeared in the hall with her hair cut short and her dowry coin placed in the mouth of a crow. In the south, a different noblewoman chose silence. Her name was Usabet, the Duchess of Kelmere, a widow of 42 winters, sharp-eyed and heavily perfumed. But for years she had attended councils, hosted poets, upheld decorum. Then, one day, she appeared in court without any jewelry. Instead, her gown was embroidered, very faintly, with verses. In a colour only slightly darker than the silk. She did not speak during the hearing. She only stood, and the younger wives of the court turned to look at her. Some whispered. One began to weep. And in that moment, something cracked. Isolde heard of these women not from the mouths of messengers, but from strangers on the road. A potter's son recited Alira's rhyme while filling clay with salt. A ferryman told Thera that he saw a duchess touch the water and whisper, "Even still I carry flame." The songs had grown teeth. They were no longer just whispers of sorrow, they were choices. And choices the world feared. Even lords who had never laid hand on a woman began locking their doors tighter. Even priests who had never met Isolde began warning against the spread of dangerous memory. They did not name it revolution. But it did not smell like decay. It smelled like rosemary and ink. One evening, Isolde returned from a gathering to find a bundle tied with blue thread waiting at their camp. Inside, a loaf of dark bread, a vial of salt, and a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, refined. "You do not know me, but I have worn your words like armor. I cannot speak them aloud. But I will make them impossible to forget." Why Ira turned the note over. "Why, Usabet?" Isolde said. They said nothing more, but the bread was shared in silence and the salt poured into the fire like an offering. In the city of Garantold, a group of scholars held a secret meeting in a locked wine cellar. They were all women, all literate, all frightened. They'd found verses scratched into the margins of ancient texts, rewritten in candle soot, hidden between lines of poetry. One scholar unrolled a scroll, pointing to where the ink had been shifted, slightly off-center, to form a second text if read vertically. "The wound is not yours to name. The silence is not yours to own." They were stunned. One woman whispered, "It's in the very breath of the books." Another said, "We've been reading it for years, and only now we see it." And that night they began to rewrite more, not by changing the stories, but by revealing the ones that had always been there, buried in the breath. Elsewhere, a song broke out in the middle of a feast. A servant girl, no older than 15, began humming while pouring wine. It was soft, a tune from no known composer. As she kissed the flame, it did not burn, it bowed. Her mistress slapped her, but the girl did not flinch. The lord of the house demanded her name. She did not speak, but someone at the table whispered, "Her name is Fire." It was no longer about Isolde, no longer about the circle. It was about something older, something buried in every woman who had ever been told to smile in silence, to bleed in secret, to obey with grace. And now, those women were planting verses in their daughters' dreams. The fire had taken root, not in books, but in bodies, and it would not be forgotten. The night they gathered, it was not planned. There were no messages sent by crow, no signs left in moss or stone, no chants, no drums, no calls across the valley, and yet they came, by the dozens, then hundreds, then hundreds. Silent, barefoot, draped not in finery or armor, but in memory, ash-dyed cloaks, herbs tucked behind ears, verses painted beneath skirts and sleeves. Each woman bore a line from a story no one else had finished. They met in a clearing no map had ever drawn, a place once used for burnings. Thera stood beside Isolde, wind curling around her wrists like old promises. "Do you think they know?" she whispered. Isolde didn't answer. She was watching the firewood being placed at the center, not to burn anyone, but to burn everything that had once silenced them. They came from all directions. Nuns with ink-stained fingers, maids still wearing aprons stiff from wine and ash, widows with grey hair woven into braids of mourning. Even girls not yet of bleeding age arrived, eyes wide, verses stitched into the hems of their tunics. At the edge of the clearing, Duchess Isabelle stood in silence, her embroidered gown glinting faintly under starlight. Near her, Lady Alira lit a single candle and pressed it into the hand of a stranger. The stranger was a farmer's wife, face lined, lips cracked, but she took the candle as if it were the hilt of a blade. Ira raised a wooden bowl above her head. In it, salt rosemary, a single black ribbon, and fragments of parchment inked with old verses. She looked at Isolde. The woman nodded once. And then Ira cast the bowl into the flame. It roared, not with fury, but recognition. There were no speeches, only breath, only the rustle of sleeves as hands clasped together. And then one voice from somewhere in the circle sang the first line. "I was not born with silence in my mouth." Another answered, "You tried to sew it shut, but I bit the thread." Then a third, and I've been singing ever since. And the songs rose, not like war cries, but like remembering. Layered, woven, a tapestry of sorrow and birth, of hunger and defiance, of sweat and milk and blood. In a distant chapel, a priest stumbled during mass. He heard them. In the vaulted rafters, a hum that didn't belong. In the bell tones, a discord that echoed with unfamiliar cadence. He dropped the chalice. The red wine bled across the altar like a wound. In the capital, a court scribe returned to her desk to find her scrolls rearranged. No longer legal text, but verses written in looped feminine hands. She wept, but not from fear, from relief. At the edge of the world, a lord awoke in his bedchamber gasping, his dreams full of smoke, of footsteps, of names he thought he'd forgotten. Back in the clearing, the fire burned high. Thera turned to Isolde. "This is the end," she whispered. "I know," Isolde said, placing a palm over her heart. "This is the name." And across the ring, women began to speak their names aloud, not in chorus, but one by one, by one, by one. Some were old names, the ones given at birth, others were new, names they had given themselves in silence, in pain, in defiance. I am the breath behind the door. I am the bruise that never faded. I am the salt in the wound. I am the mother who buried him and lived. I am fire. I am the verse they could not erase. By dawn the clearing was empty. No trace remained, no ashes, no thread, no name carved into bark. But in every town the women passed on their way home, verses began to appear, etched into well stones, stitched beneath children's sleeves, sung by girls skipping rope. And in every village where a girl had once been burned for the wrong words, her name was now written on smoke and lips and memory. They could not stop it, because it was no longer rebellion, it was language, and it spoke for itself.